Madam Chair and members of the Commission. This is a study on language development milestones and parent resources for young, deaf, and hard of hearing children. The study mandate comes from Senate Bill 1741 from last session, introduced by Senator Edwards, which focuses on language acquisition and development of children 0 to 5 years old. That bill was PBI'd in the Senate Education and Health and sent to this commission for consideration. So 2 to 3 newborns per 1,000 experience hearing loss and are born each year experiencing hearing loss, with that number doubling by kindergarten due to later onset hearing loss. The hearing loss can range from mild to profound and from unilateral to bilateral. And the vast majority of children who are deaf or hard of hearing are born to hearing parents. And there are some statistics there about how many are born each year in Virginia. Because any degree of hearing loss raises risks of delay in language acquisition and literacy development, hearing loss has historically had a number of adverse consequences on developmental outcomes. Most deaf and hard of hearing children have historically arrived at kindergarten language delayed, and there's an often cited statistic that 12th grade, the median reading ability of 12th graders is the 4th grade level, with only 10% achieving age-appropriate language skills. So when we talk about language, it's a system of communication that may or may not have an auditory component. As an example, American Sign Language is recognized as a language that is distinct from English and that for the most part is visual. While the mode of American Sign Language is signing, there's several other modalities by which English can be expressed, including spoken English and English with visual supports. Research indicates that children who fully access any language, whether it's signed or spoken, achieve the same developmental milestones at the same rate and the same order. And research has also established that acquisition of any language is a necessary precursor to literacy in any language and broader child development. And that acquiring language early on in life is key to all of these. Communication options range from mainly visual to mainly auditory, and visual includes ASL and English in its written form, and mainly auditory approaches involve oral approaches, what's more commonly known as listening and spoken language. And then there are other kind of modalities, communication modalities, such as cued speech, which is the use of visual supplements in spoken language, and total communication, which combines several different forms of communication. Until relatively recently, in the advent of technologies and newborn screening programs, there's only really a small percentage of children who are deaf and hard of hearing who are successful in acquiring spoken language. Since the late 1990s, improvements in these technologies, such as cochlear implants, which are surgically implanted and replicate sound, or improvements in hearing aids, which amplify sound for those who have residual hearing, have begun to change this landscape. While the research is very clear on the importance of language acquisition, it is not clear on which communication modes are optimal for language development or literacy. And this is particularly true for the 90 to 95% of children who are born to hearing parents. So as I detail in the appendix, there is continued debate on which communication approaches are most likely to result in successful language acquisition. And there are many factors beyond a communication approach that play into that. So moving on to the system of services and supports for this population in Virginia. This is a schematic of different agencies and programs. Really, the three main components are, first, at the very top, the VDH's Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program, which has as its goals screening before the first month of age for all newborns, diagnosis by 3 months or before 3 months, and getting children into early intervention services by 6 months. The second major component are the early intervention services, which are developed through Individualized Family Service Plans, or IFSPs. And then in the third major component children diagnosed with hearing loss are eligible for early childhood special education services developed through individualized educational programs, primarily the Department of Education, but also the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. And on this slide are a number of other programs and services by various agencies to help support this population. So Virginia, like in most states at this point, almost all newborns receive an initial hearing screening. However, like in many other states, there is a significant portion who fail an initial screening, but a definitive diagnosis remains unknown because of reasons of loss to follow-up. And annually, up to 200 children 0 to 3 years old are receiving early intervention services with hearing loss as an eligibility reason. And annually, around up to 300 children ages 2 to 5 receive early childhood special education services. But because a diagnosis of hearing loss does not automatically qualify a child for early childhood special education services, and due to the fact that the early intervention data system is somewhat antiquated and can't provide information on how many transition, the number of children who transition, the percentage of children who are receiving early intervention and then transition onto early childhood special education services remains unknown. So what's currently known about language development and literacy for this population here in Virginia? Data reported federally related to early intervention and early childhood special education services can't really address that question directly. What DBHDS and the Department of Education do report are these 3 broad child development outcomes as part of federal reporting requirements for the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDA. The second indicator, acquisition and use of knowledge and skills, it relates to language acquisition, but it is not really a direct measure of it per se. And so because of this, we really have no direct measures at this point for this population. Now, having said that, what we do have a little bit for older children are beginning in 3rd grade. For grade school children, there is information on English reading and writing and literacy, and so that does provide some insights into language acquisition at stages and ages a little bit older than the population we're focused on. And this indicates a couple of things. First, children with any disability lag in terms of literacy, passing literacy rates compared to those who do not have any disabilities. And secondly, those who have hearing impairment as their primary disability category track pretty closely to those with any disability. All right, so the next series of slides steps through the bill and some considerations that came up. Just to briefly touch on what this bill focuses on, there are 4 major components. First is developing a parent resource that includes milestones in ASL and English, as well as other information on programs and services for parents. And that is to be developed with the input of a stakeholder advisory committee. The second component is developing an educator resource, which is selecting actual instruments or tools by which to assess language acquisition and literacy. That also should be informed by the stakeholder committee. Third is the integration of language milestones tracking into the IFSP and IEP processes. And fourth is the production of a report of language and literacy outcome of deaf and hard of hearing children based on these milestones. And throughout, DBHDS is identified as the implementing agency coordinating with the Department of Education and the Department for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So just a word on this study. As part of this, we convened a stakeholder work group with wide-ranging participation with agencies and advocacy organizations, as well as parents and others of deaf and hard of hearing children. There were a couple points of general consensus, which are primarily philosophical in nature, that early language acquisition is critical for full language and cognitive development, including literacy, and that parents really should be able to choose their preferred communication languages and modes. The points of continued disagreement were pretty much everything to do with the bill, and there wasn't any kind of consensus on that piece. So, there are several terms used in this bill that merit explicit definition. There are a couple examples provided here. Some can have multiple meanings in different contexts. Other terms that are commonly used with deaf and hard of hearing persons, such as the communication modality listening and spoken language, has some industry meanings. Because of this, my first recommendation, and it's a pretty basic one, is that if the JCHC considers legislation similar intent to this bill, is to simply define the key terms. I think it's especially important given the subject matter here. As I go through, there'll be a number of slides with these recommendations. These should not be interpreted as work group consensus recommendations. They're my recommendations based on the input that I heard and received, as well as my own research. Secondly, the bill identifies DBHDS as the implementing agency, but there are various reasons why it may not be best positioned to serve as a lead agency. Its programming is focused on disabilities broadly and not on hearing loss per se, and its programming is limited to children 0 to 3 years old. There are two agencies that whose missions do relate more directly to this population. The Department for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing's mission is to promote accessible communication to deaf and hard of hearing persons, although it is not focused on children per se. And the Virginia School for the Deaf and the Blind, even though it is not mentioned in this bill, its mission is to provide education to deaf and hard of hearing persons 0 to 21 years old. Given that the bill calls for compiling language development milestones and assessment instruments for young children, I would recommend identifying VSDB as the implementing agency coordinating with DBHDS, VDDH, and VDOE to implement the legislation provisions if the JCHC were to consider similar legislation. And for your reference, I asked VSDB to come up with an estimate if they were to implement this, what would the projected fiscal impact be compared to what DBHDS estimated when the bill was introduced. The bill requires the development of a parent resource that contains both language development milestones and information about ASL and English and available programs and services. Right now in Virginia, there already are two. Oh, did I skip over a slide? No, I went to the wrong slide. Sorry about that. I'll go ahead over that in a moment. The milestones and language development assessments. So this bill requires the selection of language development milestones drawn from standardized norms. Frankly, it's a little unclear what that criterion means. From my research, it is mixing a couple of different aspects of language evaluation. And as importantly as the technical details, if this were to take the approach of mandating milestones based on norm-referenced instruments, which is, I think, what the bill is intending, it's not entirely clear what that would gain, in the sense that if milestones were drawn from various norm-referenced tools, state-specific ones, the milestones that would result would not in themselves be norm referenced. They would not have been tested on any other population, and there would be no norms to draw upon. So as I said, it's not really entirely clear what is gained by requiring that they be based on norm referenced instruments. And additionally, there are many instruments already used by providers and educators to assess language development that are not norm referenced or standardized. And to this end, there's a similar bill in Louisiana focused on these same issues, and it was their particular task force recommendation to use an instrument that was not norm referenced or standardized. So because of all this, my recommendation is, if there's legislation similar to this bill that is considered, is to really modify the basis for milestone selection away from necessarily being norm referenced, but require that it be appropriate and technically sound, or some sort of verbiage, to provide flexibility to the implementing agency to draw appropriate milestones. And if this is coupled with the recommendation of VSDB being the implementing agency, one can hope that they have the expertise to do so. All right, now we're on to the parent resource. So there's a parent resource that's required. This provides some information. Currently, there are already 2 parent resources that are produced. supported by VDH and the Department of Education and produced by VCU, and they speak to many of the provisions in this bill. They provide information on hearing and hearing loss, on communication approaches, on the IFSP and IEP processes, as well as a different, and then, so the Green Guide, they both provide this kind of information. The Green Guide is provided to parents as soon as a child 0 to 3 is diagnosed with hearing loss. And the Orange Guide provides additional information related to the school age set. Now, crucially, it does not include information on language milestones because that wasn't, I mean, at the time that this was written, that was not really a subject of discussion. But it is expected to begin its revision process beginning next year. So my recommendation would be, if legislation like SB 1741 were considered, is to use the existing resources as a basis for the parent resource. The bill requires the formation of an advisory committee and provides both the size and very, very specific qualifications about what individuals, the skills that they're supposed to bring to the table. Legislating the precise committee size and composition does risk omitting relevant perspectives. There are 16 different combinations of language and modalities that are recognized by the Department of Education as languages of means of instruction, and many different perspectives. And given this, this approach really risks excluding people who may be knowledgeable and have various perspectives, as well as, say, candidates who have multiple qualifications and can serve more than one role on the advisory committee. So I believe that Virginia has an opportunity to learn from similar legislation in other states, which has really evolved to allowing their agencies or implementing agencies to play more of a role in determining really the specifics about the advisory committee, such as in Indiana, where really the sole criterion is that their implementing agency ensured that the membership of the advisory committee includes a balanced representation of deaf or hard of hearing perspectives. Additionally, there are really two different tasks of the advisory committee. One is to make recommendations on milestones, and one is to compile information on available programs and services. And so it's my recommendation that if this legislation, such as SB 1741 is considered, that it both authorize the implementing agency to have a bit more of say in the shape of the advisory committee, but stipulating minimum criteria to achieve balanced representation, and that the roles of advisory committee members be linked to their expertise more explicitly. So in terms of how the language milestones are linked to the IFSP and IEP processes, some of the bill's provisions are already captured in federal law, such as that which already permits parents to bring resources to those meetings, which could presumably include observations from milestones that they could do at this time without legislation. Having said that, a finding that emerged from the work group meetings that many parents are not actually aware of the array of language development milestone instruments, particularly for ASL. But perhaps the biggest consideration here is that linking milestone assessments to these, requiring milestone assessments would really be a fundamental shift in how DBHDS and the Department of Education, their guidance to local teams, and that would require regulatory changes. Because at the moment, neither agency require either their local early intervention system or their local education agency to use a specific set of assessment tools. And in addition to any regulatory changes that would be required, annual language milestone assessments could, and I do emphasize could, incur additional provider time and costs. I can't say whether they would or they wouldn't, but if there's a possibility, if they added more time to what providers are already doing when they're assessing, that could incur costs, and as well as costs to use tools which are proprietary in nature and have some degree of cost associated with them. There isn't a whole lot of information from other states on this front. One point of reference that I do have from Kansas implementing a similar bill with dedicated staff there, so they take a slightly different approach, but they have dedicated a staff conducting language assessments annually for 250 children, and their budget is around $465,000. Not sure that it would be the same amount here, but there are costs potentially associated with this approach. So finally, to wrap up with this bill, the Language Development Milestones Report. First, it would provide information on a subset of all deaf and hard of hearing children in Virginia, namely those who are on IFA, who are receiving IDA-based accommodations and services. It wouldn't capture those who had received early intervention and then aren't receiving early childhood special education services, as an example, or those receiving accommodations through Section 504 plans, or those simply not receiving any kind of accommodations at all. Secondly, it is the data collection would incur agency costs. DBHDS can't weigh in on that because they're in the process of procuring a new early intervention data system. The Department of Education estimates a fiscal impact of $95,000 in the first year and then around $45,000 thereafter. Thirdly, the data collected would lack a basis of comparison in Virginia, primarily because language development is not, outcomes are not collected for any other children or any other subpopulations. Having said that, it could be a means to track among this population language development over time. And finally, I would submit that collecting data on characteristics of children assessed, additional data, could more directly inform agency programming. For example, if there were gaps or disparities in milestone achievement by geographic region or communication approach, that kind of information could inform programming. My recommendations align with that, and saying if this approach were taken, that the implementing agency should determine which additional characteristics of children assessed to be collected and reported on for this report. Before going to the recommendations and policy options, there are a few slides on what might be some alternative approaches to SB 1741 that are aligned with the goal of improving language acquisition for this population. The first is simply to build on existing informational resources. I've already referenced the green and orange guides that are produced. This doesn't necessarily require new legislation to request those agencies to incorporate milestones into or alongside current and future versions. And the second is has to do with information provided by various state agencies directly involved with this population. There were multiple work group participants that highlighted the difficulty in knowing where to go to, where to access information when a diagnosis was first received. And as you saw before, the system is pretty complicated and there are a lot of agencies with a lot of different programs. So an improved public understanding of the roles of state agencies involved with this population and families could be beneficial. And my recommendation tracks to that. Secondly, I would recommend using existing literacy data to track language development outcomes. Now, first, literacy, it may be considered a kind of downstream outcome or proxy indicator for language acquisition in the sense that one cannot be literate without having acquired language. And it has the advantage of, at least written English, it is a form of communication shared by all deaf and hard of hearing persons and children, so it can be tracked in a relatively straightforward way. Currently, the Department of Education does track literacy development of children in public schools through two means. One is the Phonological Awareness Literacy Screening, or PALS, beginning in pre-K after the third grade level. And the second is the Standards of Learning Literacy Assessments, and I showed you a slide earlier on those literacy assessments. On a side note, I had expected to be able to present similar data for the PALS. For reasons that are not entirely clear to me, the Department of Education wasn't able to provide that data for me in time for this report, but I'm going to continue to work with them because it does relate to this population 0 to 5, and hopefully I will be able to, sometime after the fact, provide something similar on the achievement of those with hearing impairment as a disability compared to others for your information. And so you have a complete picture of what we already know in terms of literacy among this population. So given that there are already some literacy measures out there, I believe there's an opportunity to use existing interagency data systems to longitudinally track literacy for children, the literacy results of children with hearing loss. So the Virginia Longitudinal Data System, or the VLDS, it currently links six participating agencies, including the Department of Education. They already have their PALS and SOL literacy test results into that, onboarded into that. Right now, VDH is currently in the process of onboarding its early hearing detection and intervention data. And this provides an opportunity going forward to link any child diagnosed with hearing loss and what are their literacy outcomes later in life. And this is, as I said, using existing data and existing systems. And so my recommendation here is to use that as a basis for reporting on literacy outcomes for this population. Because hearing loss is a low incidence condition, there are many barriers to accessing services at each touch point, from screening, from providers being hesitant to providing bad results, failed results, or downplaying them. At diagnosis, there are literally a handful or even fewer of board-certified pediatric audiologists in the state, and a limited number of early intervention or early childhood special education providers in terms of services that might understand the needs of this population. So there are opportunities to build on what is already existing for early intervention. So right now, the DBHDS maintains a list of teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing that they recommend should local systems need services provided for this population. However, their geographic placement is such that even though the department believes there's enough coverage in the state to address those needs, there are barriers, geographic barriers for children to access them. DBHDS has been seeking DMAS approval to cover early intervention services as a telehealth delivered, reimbursable as a telehealth delivered service. However, recently, a DMAS memo that clarified its existing telehealth policy does not address including new or changed coverage. So early intervention continues not to be a service covered by telepractice. And then in terms of early childhood special education, there is a Virginia network of consultants, or VNOC, available to local education agencies, which could be built upon. And finally, in terms of exploring opportunities for early exposure of families to deaf role models, because it's a low incidence condition and things that we heard from the parents, it can be really difficult to meet people with lived experience and understand what the trajectory of parents, what the trajectory of their child might be, and the potential positive impact of increased exposure of families to deaf and hard of hearing adults. This has been recognized nationally through the Joint Commission on Infant Hearing. HRSA has a federally supported grant to increase the role that deaf and hard of hearing adults play in early intervention and EDI programs. However, here in Virginia, there is no such program, and multiple work group parents, as I said, indicated that there were difficulties in making contact with deaf and hard of hearing persons. So across the U.S., states support a variety of programs that are aimed at increasing the involvement of deaf and hard of hearing adults in early intervention with the intent of improving family engagement with the system and the children's language development. In particular, the Deaf Mentor Program described here, it does emphasize instruction in ASL and exposure to deaf culture, although some states, such as New Mexico, has taken an approach where it is more comprehensive than just instruction in ASL, and in fact a covered service by their Medicaid agency as a developmental service. And so even here in Virginia, the Virginia Board for People with Disabilities recommended to addressing workforce area shortage, and they called out deaf mentors. There is a limited body of research on deaf mentors and their outcomes. It's suggestive that there are potential benefits for mentoring programs for language development and self-efficacy, although I do emphasize it's a very, very limited body of knowledge that we have on that. So finally, the policy options. First is to take no action. The second is to introduce legislation and a budget amendment based on SB 1741, with the modifications listed here, which are essentially what I went through in the report, to define terms, to change the implementing agency to VSDB, to change how the advisory committee is constituted, to not create a new parent resource, but base it on an existing one, to change the basis of the milestones away from standardized norms, allow some flexibility, and finally to require that milestone data collection have additional characteristics collected of those children assessed. The remaining policy options, they kind of track with my recommendations that I provided when discussing alternative approaches to Senate Bill 1741. So this option has to do with using the VLDS as a way to link together existing literacy and hearing loss data, essentially requesting that the Department of Education use that to conduct an analysis and linking it with the EDI hearing loss data and submit a report by next year. Policy option 4 has to do with building on the currently published resource guides as a basis to include information on milestones. This is basically a non-legislative approach to request that milestone information be wrapped into those guides here and now and in the future. Policy option 5 has to do with ensuring that parents can easily know how to access information, and it's requesting that the various agencies come together, those that provide services and have information on this population, to make sure that their messaging is consistent regardless of what specific area that they are focused on. Policy option number 6 has to do with using telepractice to expand access to the services of early intervention providers who are experienced with hearing loss, and this is requiring that DMAS work with DBHDS to provide Medicaid reimbursement for early intervention services delivered by telepractice, essentially, and then as part of that, have a report indicating what kind of timeline is possible and whether there would be any required legislation, funding, or any other regulatory changes to make that happen. And the last policy option has to do with exploring programs that integrate deaf and hard of hearing adults into early intervention services. And this would be a budget amendment requiring the Department of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, in consultation with those agencies listed there, to explore programs, opportunities to develop programs connecting families of deaf and hard of hearing children with deaf and hard of hearing adults, including mentoring programs, really with the goal of increasing the uptake of early intervention services by families and providing assistance to families in sign and non-sign based communication. And again, a written report due to the JCHC in a year's time indicating how to make that happen. And that ends my presentation.
Thank you. And now for Delegate Garrett, do you have any questions or comments?
I don't at this time, Madam Chair, but thank you.
Okay. Oh.
Madam Chair.
And Senator Dance?
Yes.
Madam Chair?
Senator Sullivan.
I think that other members might be on the phone, so you might want to check.
That's correct. Senator Dance Siobhan's on the phone.
Okay.
And this is a study of particular interest to me, but I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have the report in writing. And I think that maybe what I'm going to need to do is to be able to see the recommendations and send an email back, if that's okay, so that I have the chance to digest them in writing.
And I think there's another one on too.
There should have been all 4 reports should have been emailed to you.
No, all I got was the agenda. I did not get an email with the reports. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I looked for it twice while we've been on the phone.
Okay, there are like 2. So I could maybe one of us could just follow it to you just so that you have it because I have it on my cell phone. It came as 2 separate emails. With the first one was the agenda and the second one was the staff reports. But we'll make sure you get that because that puts you at a disadvantage. And also, let's do another check-in because we did an intermittent roll call, and at that time only Delegate Garrett was on, and so I just, I made a wrong assumption. So, is there anyone else on the phone?
Yeah, Madam Chair, this is Glenn Sturtevant. I have no
Okay.
question.
Okay, do you have a question or comment? No question? Just want to make sure. So all three of them are on the line now? Okay. Delegate Corey, are you on the line? All right, we have three of the four on the line now. And thanks, Senator Suline, for reminding me to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, Madam Chair,
Senator Edwards.
I have a kind of a big picture question here. Can you capsulize the two positions in some way that, in English language, that's simple language, that one group wants to do one thing, another group wants to do another thing? Can you, there's a lot of disagreement here. Can you capsulize the differences?
Sure. I think, you know what, I'll refer back to, I will attempt to do so. I will, on the stakeholder work group input, it's the points of continued disagreement. The first one, let's skip over the definition of language versus communication modality. I think some of the bigger picture ones are, do we really need additional information, a group to come together that would incur some sort of cost to do so, to have additional information on what's out there, this parent resource, when there already is information and lots of programs and services.
So we put that in, Madam Chair, I put that in the category, do we really need this?
That is, that okay. I think was a point of discussion.
Right.
Okay. And then I'll probably one of the bigger points was the data collection. What would that achieve? Right now there are a few direct measures of language development, but the question is, by collecting data on language development and having a data point, this many children achieved, let's say milestones were put together, this percentage of children achieved their milestones or not, what would that do for us? Would that help services in any way? Would that inform programming? What could we do with that information? Is that really is it worth it? I think and some people would say yes, very much so, and some people would say would be hesitant.
Yeah, Madam Chair, is that in the category of expense? Do we?
I don't think just expense, but also to what end? Meaning, what is this going to allow the state to do better?
This kind of goes back to the first category of, do we really need this?
Yeah, I think in many ways. Okay. And then again, there's some that feel very strongly that yes, it is needed, and some that feel very strongly that it isn't, and then many in between.
Okay. Anything else? Those are the two categories. Madam Chair, is it that the second category of people who say we don't really need it, it's too expensive and so forth, they're satisfied with what they're getting at the private sector?
Well, that's where I think maybe some of the disagreement is this where efforts should be focused? That everyone acknowledges, or many people acknowledge, that there are gaps in the system, that it is not, it's difficult for many of this population to access services or be successful in acquiring language. Should our efforts as a Commonwealth, public and private, be focused on improving that system or on collecting data related to language milestones?
Madam Chair, the system that is, should we just leave it the way it is with the private sector system in effect? Versus
it relies on private sector providers, or at least I'm sure there's a mix. It depends on how, if you're working with a Chesterfield County as a local early education provider, I'm not sure if it's, in the private sector or the public sector, but it is a mix.
Well, Madam Chair, if the people in the first category want the state to do something, is any recommendation that the people in say call it the private sector that are happy with the way things are, is there any requirement that those that are happy the way things are going to be disrupted with the state getting more involved?
You mean if this bill were to pass?
Yes.
I think to the extent that it would require a change in practice, there may be downstream consequences that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, right now, through an individualized family service plan or individualized education program, if one is receiving services, how those services are provided and the types of services depends very much on what that team with the parents and the providers have decided is appropriate for that child. If then a new system were, as part of this now, there's a standardized way of assessing literacy language development that could impact the time they have to devote to those services as opposed to measuring.
Well, Madam Chair, could there be an opt-in or opt-out part of this system if the bill passes? I mean, parents could say, I'm not going to participate.
Opt-in for the providers or for
for the parents. Opt-in.
I think they currently can. My understanding is that currently, and maybe I can turn to my Department of Education and Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services colleagues, but if a parent wants to bring in, there's some milestones out there. South California has a checklist. Kansas has some milestones out there. They're state specific. My understanding is a parent could come in with that information to an IFSP meeting or an IEP meeting and say, I want this to be an input into that process. And the team would have to consider it. Now, what the team does with that information is on a case-by-case basis. So in a way, I think there already is an opt-in, opt-out kind of system. It's just maybe that many parents aren't aware of different milestones for different communication modes.
Is there a way, Madam Chair, to have the two groups come together with something they both are happy with?
It was not clear to me from the process of the past several months what that would look like.
So the answer is right now, you're not sure, huh? That's right.
Okay, I think we're getting a drilling here. So can you, we do have another presentation. So if there are some more questions that you would like to have or something else that you would require from our presenter here, then that might be something we can work out. Because I don't think we're getting to where you want to be with this one. And it looks like Senator Barker wanted to ask a question or comment as well.
Yes, a question, make sure I'm understanding at least part of this in terms of the process and who does what. It appears to me, based upon the data that you're providing, that it's roughly 250 newborns per year that are deaf or hard of hearing, and it increases to about 600 per year by the time they reach kindergarten. And it appears as though, given the numbers that are in the early intervention program, which is Birth to 3, versus the numbers that are in the Department of Education program, which the early intervention being seen through the CSBs, that it's about a quarter to a third of those are served in those programs. And the majority are not served in those programs, so either receiving something outside of that, maybe in the private sector, or nothing at all in those situations. Is that an accurate assessment of things? And then my major question following up on that is you're recommending in option 2 of having the Virginia School for the Deaf and the Blind have primary implementation responsibility, and how does that fit with what the CSBs are doing in the early intervention program and the Department of Education is doing for basically the 3 and 4 year olds?
Certainly. In terms of the numbers, I think one could make I hadn't made the calculations, but one could make some estimates about what percentage that, based on national data, what percentage those formerly receiving services are compared to the whole population. I'm certainly happy to go back and do the numbers myself and see if I'm getting the same kind of numbers you are. The second question, really the implementing agency here is not to implement services, but it's to come up with a product, the parent resource and the educator resource. But this would not be that the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind would now be providing or doing what DVHDS already does. It would not be that they were doing what the Department of Education already does with their local education agencies. They're just coming up with here are the milestones. They would convene a process to develop milestones for the state and also say here are the specific tools that are needed to be used in order to come up with, in order to assess those milestones. So they wouldn't, by implementing agency, it's really, the provisions of the bill don't relate directly to services provided, because that's covered under IDA funding. It's really the framework under which those services are provided as it relates to language acquisition.
Just one quick follow-up, Madam Chair. Yeah. With the, and under that option 2 there, if they're the implementing entity, would then the CSBs and the Department of Education and local school boards be responsible for complying with whatever the Department of
Exactly.
For the Deaf and the Blind?
I mean, the way it's currently written, whatever DBHD comes up with, the Department of Education, the CSBs and the local school boards would have to comply with that. The only difference is whatever VSDB comes up with, those other agencies would have to comply with.
All right.
But the VSDB itself would not be taking over any kind of role as in the actual assessments. That would be still with local early intervention systems and local education agencies.
I think we'll have to consider that, I guess, so, thank you.
Okay, so this is not over until we get some feedback. There will be opportunities for public comment on these recommendations as we have them right now. So I will thank you for the awesome task you had of trying to provide that information. And now we'll move on to the last presentation.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. This morning I am going to be discussing prescription drug price gouging.